again, and welcome to the next roundtable discussion here with the Concours Virtual. I'm delighted we're now talking about the golden age of Detroit, and we've got some good people to join us. But first of all, let me introduce myself. He says, scrolling down here. So my name is Richard Charlesworth. Even if you haven't bumped into me at a classic event, you may have heard me over the PA as Master of Ceremonies for the Quail, a motorsports gathering. I'm curator and presenter of the Concours of Elegance at Hampton Court Palace, as well as being presenter at the London Concours. I'm also an established concours judge and reasonably well known for my association with Bentley Motors, having worked for the company since 1974, most recently as Director of Royal and VIP Relations, Head of the Heritage Collection, and as Brand Ambassador. But with us today as well is Simon Taylor, who's on your screen there. Simon was editing the magazine Autosport by the age of 23, and then as Managing Director of Haymarket magazines, he launched titles like Classic and Sports Car, What Car, and F1 Racing, and took over the world's oldest car magazine, Autocar. He also commentated for over 20 years on F1 for BBC Radio and ITV. He's now editor-at-large of Classic and Sports Car, a concours judge, and a successful entrant too, netting trophies at Pebble Beach and Salon Privé. And in his garage are a 1950 HWM, which he's raced in the UK, the USA and Australia, and a wonderful gurney-nutting Derby Bentley Sedanka, which I do love, and an AC Ace. So great to have you with us, Simon. Now, when a young Ken Gross met enthusiasts with an MGTC and a home-built Formula Libre special, and later discovered a May 1954 issue of Road and Track, his interest in cars and then automotive journalism was ignited. Since then, he's written for a variety of magazines, including Sports Car Market, the Rodders Journal, Playboy, Road and Track, and Magneto. He's also authored several automotive books, spent 4 years as executive director of the Peterson Automotive Museum, curated museum exhibitions, and judged at Pebble Beach for more than 20 years. And last and by no means least at all in this particular conversation is Richard Earl, who is, as many of you know, the grandson of American car designer and visionary Harley J. Earl, who was responsible for the first concept car, the Buick Y-Job, and pioneered the use of free-form sketching and hand-sculpted clay models. Richard has spent the last 24 years, 10 of which were in Detroit, unearthing a story on America's mid-20th century automobile world. He is the only descendant of Harley J. Earl to pursue an automobile-related career since his grandfather passed away in 1969. Richard is a public speaker, so probably you should be sitting here, Richard, and edits the official harleyjearl.com website. So, gentlemen, you're all welcome. Ken, we'll try and include you in, even though sadly you're going to have to remain muted for now. But we're going to hopefully have some interesting conversations around this golden age of Detroit subject, as well then as later in this roundtable discussion, looking at some of the cars that are entered in the concours, in this class in the concours, to chat about them. And we have we've got 11 entrants in all, from the 1949 Cadillac Series 62 Club Coupe, a gorgeous looking, highly competed race car, right the way through to 1963 Pontiac Tempest. So we have an eclectic mix, but all of them are stunning. All of them have a great backstory. And we're looking forward to hearing more about them. So Richard, can I come to you first? What on earth was going on in the USA that led to this explosion in fins and tails and exuberant design in cars?
Well, let me just take a breath and just say it's kind of fortuitous that I have the prototype of the Sabre up on the wall here. You can kind of see it.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And it's got these enormous tail fins. Hello. So it's kind of fitting that this question would kick off first, because the president of General Motors at this time in the late 40s, when the Sabre was in development as the second concept car that Harley, the big one that he was going to do post-war, and the C.E. Wilson, the president of GM at the time, was asked by a reporter, what do you think is going to happen with the marketplace? And he's like, look, I don't know what's going to happen, but the price of progress is trouble. And that's what this car kind of represented when Harley put these enormous tail fins on a concept car that was going to be of its own design, which he intended to drive and would become the concept car of all concept cars of the mid 20th century going into the 50s. And then every car company wished to follow GM, and not only it started with this car, but of course the 48 Cadillac with a little bit potato bump, and then it just grew. A lot of people inside GM didn't like it, so Harley, along with Sloan and the other Dream Team leaders, were like, well, Harley's like, I've got an idea. Let's put the tail fins facing the front of the car dealerships and see what the clients want, the consumer, and they just went crazy. And the rest of the story's history, because he put this visual prestige marking on the back end of a car, and that always was on the front end of a car, and people just loved it and couldn't get enough of it. So of course, the fins started to grow on all of the fabulous 5 brands of General Motors, and then by the mid 50s, it was off to the races, and every car company in the world, you had Italians and Europeans all putting tail fins on their cars. It was the in vogue thing to do. And as far away, and believe me, Russia was as far away as you could possibly go in car design. And they even put tail fins on their cars.
They've still got them, haven't they? I mean, the ZIL limousines and what have you have got huge, great fins on them. Amazing. I mean, Ken, bear with us. I was going to talk to you about this, but Richard, perhaps you could continue on this, because in 1950, Detroit's population hit 1.85 million, making it then the 4th largest city in the USA, with nearly 300,000 manufacturing jobs. But by 1958, so 8 years later, the Packard factory, which was 3.5 million square feet, closed. You know, I mean, you said that GM were saying that, you know, there was always an element of risk in going off a different direction. But what happened to so soon afterwards? What happened to Packard?
Well, the Packard brothers, as you know, they were the leaders in the luxury car marketplace until Cadillac came along and took the lead. And that's a great story. But here we are in the in the 50s, and boy, if you did not follow what General Motors was doing in the obsolescence of design at that time in the industry, you were quickly going to go out of business. And it was fast and furious. It was technology moving ahead so quickly, kind of like this let's go pace that we're living today was happening in the 50s. And it all, you know, it was all coming out of GM styling, and you know, Harley had created this new template, which was this car design language, and by the late 50s, it was the #1 form of, I mean, car design, and many would say it's still the #1 reason for car sales, regardless of safety and fuel economy. You know, people are still drawn in, of course, cars being the world's most adored consumer product. You know, they're drawn in by the look of the car, and a lot of it was, you know, just getting started. I mean, really off to the races in the 50s, because that was the golden era of American and I would say car design globally.
Well, yeah, no, you're right. I mean, Simon, one for you. I mean, we've seen, as Richard has said, this link between, you know, aircraft styling and automotive styling, and how this became the DNA of it, you know, such that the back end was parked towards the showroom window rather than the front end. But you know, this close relationship between automotive and car styling. How long did this go on for? I mean, did this survive through the 50s into the 60s?
I would take a slightly more cynical view. I mean, obviously I admire to Richard's enormous knowledge. But it seems to me that the use that automobiles made of aircraft was more styling than in terms of efficiency. I mean, we know, for example, that Chrysler did a lot of work before the airflow came out in the wind tunnel. I think they were one of the first companies to do that. But the link between, the technical link between aircraft and automobiles, I think only appeared more in specialized motor cars, probably in Europe, like, I don't know, the Bristol, for example,
Yeah.
actually built by an aircraft company. But what aircraft did was aircraft were always exciting things. They went fast, coming out of World War II, where they'd played the most enormous role. And when people were starting to fly across the Atlantic without thinking about it, aircraft were very glamorous, and they epitomized speed, they epitomized technology. And therefore it made a lot of sense for stylists to take cues from aircraft. But I don't think they were really doing it, broadly speaking, I don't think they were really doing it for technological reasons. They were doing it for marketing reasons.
Yeah.
And good for them. I mean,
Yeah.
it was a wonderful way of making a car exciting, whether it was Harley's tail fins or any of the other elements, which had a kind of quasi-aeronautical look to them. But I don't think it was technology, was it, coming out of aircraft? It was more market. It was marketing the shape, the excitement of aircraft.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'll come back to you, Richard, if I may, because I'd love to explore the impact on American culture of automotive design, if you like. But just wanted to come back to you, Ken, bless him, who wanted just to say about the Packard. It said Packard styling had become stagnant. Their engineering stalled for lack of funds and sales, and the European and Japanese makes had become selling more cars. So the US industry was slow to react to the influx of smaller, affordable economic cars, was his point as to how, in some cases, the luster went off of Detroit's leadership quite early on later in the 50s, but early on in terms of that era. But Richard, coming back to that, so, what was the impact, of the automobile on American culture more broadly in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and how much has that changed today, do you think?
Well, I personally, everything became about looking fast and streamlined in design, and design really before the 30s, the late 20s didn't really exist, and so you had a brand new force that was entering the business world, and how important things that consumers wanted were going to look good, and the better designed, more streamlined, the more you could charge, and people would go crazy for toasters or fans. You had this explosion in industrial design, but under the umbrella of industrial design was the car design profession, and it was the largest sector. And as you know, that was the time where the product designers outside of the car design world, they were a little jealous of the car designers, because let's face it, the automobile, and what Detroit created, many would say it's still the automotive capital of the world. And I would say that because of number, stats, and finance, that because of car design, it's the world's most not only adored consumer product, but it's the most important product. And in number, stats, and finance, when you add up the numbers, millions and millions of units selling all for over $10,000, $20,000 a piece, ranging up to over 100,000, the numbers are staggering. So it's a huge global automotive economy now. It used to be, in America, and of course, it affected everything, especially the culture. And, many would say Harley was creating pop culture by these designs and excitement in the Hollywoodization of Detroit. And it's so fitting that, of course, he came from Hollywood. His father was a late 19th century coach builder who liked the Fishers, Fisher Body Brothers in Detroit. They sniffed the winds of change, went into the automobile industry early in the century, and never looked back. But it was all about the country embracing this new element of automotive styling, but it was really mass art and amazing works of art and engineering that were based towards the consumer, and it was the largest predator. I mean, it was the largest marketplace in the world for consumers to spend, and the second most expensive purchase they'd ever make in their entire lifetimes. They'd buy these cars multiple times throughout their life. And the first most expensive, of course, was a home. But people like you and me, we don't go out and trade and buy homes all the time. You know, we might buy one and two over our entire lifetime, and that's the most expensive purchase. But the automobile, for over 100+ years in a row, uninterrupted, has been this exciting, visceral, you know, design-fueled beauty that you know, people go crazy about, and you know, not much has changed, even though a lot of things have changed. These things, you know, are somebody going to be collecting an original iPhone 50 years from now, you know, and I don't think it's going to have the pop and the circumstance and pomp and love and admiration that us car lovers have for these product designs. I'm sorry, I hope I wasn't too long-winded.
No, fascinating. I just wanted to, I'll come to a question for Simon in a second, but just wanted to throw in a couple of comments from Ken there. He was, when we were talking about the styling revolution, he said, in addition to GM, in addition to your grandfather, he said you have to give credit to Virgil Exner and Luigi Segre for fins.
Absolutely.
You know, the Ghia Dart show car tested fins in the wind tunnel, and soon Chrysler's fins towered over GM's until the fad and the fins receded, of course. And he also commented that planned obsolescence also played a large part here. You know, society had become conditioned to want a new car every year or every other year to keep up with the Joneses. So fair point. Mind you, that's, I guess, still the case with iPhones. But I was going to as well say to you that, you know, when we think of films like Grease, you know, where the car was the star, and this was the time when, you know, all you wanted to do to impress your friends, impress the girls, was have the latest, best, swoopiest, biggest finned car that you could have. But Simon, one for you, if I may. You know, we were talking earlier about the influence of aircraft on the cars from Detroit at this time was largely a visual one. It was not about technical content, but you know, while the focus is on design and styling, the chassis and powertrain of these Detroit motors were pretty impressive as well, weren't they?
Well, absolutely. I mean, if you make the comparison between what was going on in Europe and what was going on in the United States, people might argue that the Europeans were moving more quickly into more up-to-date braking and more up-to-date suspension. But that was partly because the Americans knew exactly what they were doing. They were producing a product which was ideal for the home market, where, of course, the Europeans were left behind, unless you were talking about huge, expensive V12 four overhead cam engines from Ferrari and the like, was that the American pushrod V8s were wonderful engines. And I don't think the Europeans understood how to mass produce cheaply horsepower in the way that the Americans did. The other thing, I mean, the whole comparison between Europe and America is absolutely fascinating. An awful lot of it is market driven, because if you did have in 1949 a Series 62 Cadillac and you wanted to drive it from Croydon to Somerset, you would have quite a lot of difficulty because it wouldn't really fit the roads. So what happened in Europe is that the styling, sometimes in a slightly watered down fashion, General Motors owned Vauxhall, Ford owned Ford, and obviously the great styling cues came over to Europe and were fitted to smaller cars. And when you started to fit some of the most flamboyant bits of American styling onto a Vauxhall Wyvern, you had a few problems because it didn't always quite work.
Well, I was going to say to you as well, you know, we have seen some of these astonishing, the American, this is the real thing, you know, built in Detroit. We've seen a few of them on European roads, but not that many because they're rare. Now, is that because our roads are too narrow or our imagination is too narrow?
Well, I think the people who buy, I mean, are you talking about modern American cars?
No, I was talking about this era.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, I mean, collectors, there are, I mean, there is a whole posse of people who love American cars, either people who have an American car in their collection. I mean, I have to say that the car in my garage, which I've owned the longest, I bought it for £2,000 in 1972 when it was 3 years old.
Mm.
And it was my only car for quite a long time. And that was my small block Corvette Stingray. And I still have it. It's not worth a lot of money, but I love it and I shall probably never sell it. I hope I never have to sell it. Now that's quite a small American car in terms of overall dimensions. But it's a wonderful car for British roads. I mean, it does have independent suspension all round. It does have disc brakes all round. So it steers and stops excellently. I happen to think that the 68 onwards Stingray is the most handsome of all the Stingrays and all the Corvettes. So there certainly are people, I mean, there are some people who have enormous collections of American cars in this country and don't have anything else. And that, interestingly, they often dress appropriately. I mean, I love it when somebody dresses the same way, you know, their taste in clothes is the same as their taste in cars. And if you go to one of these wonderful UK American car rallies, you will see people wearing, maybe a bit self-consciously, but they are wearing 1950s rock and roll garb. And I guess that probably doesn't happen in quite the same way when you have a gathering of 50s American cars in the States.
I guess not. But Richard, back to you. By the way, Simon, I think you probably get your money back if you did try and sell that car now. You probably get at least a couple of grand for it. But Richard, coming back to you, you know, obviously we're going back to these magnificent cars from that era. You know, they're big cars, as Simon's saying. You don't see many of them on English roads. You might the more modern cars or the slightly more compact. But even in hometown, are these cars that are there to show or to drive? I mean, the people who have them, and there are many around to see. We've got some great examples in our class. Do you drive long distances in them, or do you take them places and let them be admired and talk?
You know, it's such a they're the volume of these cars and General Motors, the prowess in the late 50s, for example. A lot of the cars in this class, of course, you know, I posed this question before on a panel with like Craig Jackson, you know, who's a real expert on values and whatnot, and said something like because I believe this, the automotive marketplace, even today, it's the largest art market in the world. And of course, these collector cars in the millions from the late 50s are out there in the 60s when I mean, we're talking really desirable cars, many of which are the ones that we're talking about today. And I think personally, you know, I live in South Florida, so weather has an enormous amount to do with life. If you have a convertible, any one of these cars that we're judging today, I mean, are looking at, you're talking about a real incredible piece of, well, I wanted to say this, like Harley, the Fishers, and the Dream Team leaders at GM, like Alfred Sloan and Big Bill Knudsen, they wrapped their arms around this idea, and it was the belief that brought Harley Earl to Detroit, that I'm going to risk my reputation to get you guys to risk your reputation on the belief that a car not only could be, but should be a declaration of personal style. Yeah. And by the mid-50s, you had millions of people embracing that. And they wore the car like they wore a suit or a dress. Women, men, kids, everybody was just so enthralled. It was an intoxicatingly elaborate segment in time, and not much has changed. You don't have the volume of great convertibles and two-tones and chrome and all that, but who knows, maybe it's going to come back. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if the right people got involved with the fins to see little fins come back later on, but I think later it'd have to be once the story was truly humanized for the first time, what happened at General Motors in the mid 20th century around these dream team leaders. Anyway, I hope I didn't get off on the wrong track.
No. In a minute, Richard, I'll give you a warning. Let's try and, if you want to have a go at it, screen share to look at some of the cars we've got in this class. But the comment I was going to make was, and I'd like your take on this as well, Simon, I think that one of the greatest restrictions that was placed on styling and design was legislation. Most of it came initially from the US as well. You know, think of the Ralph Naders and what have you, imposing restrictions on car design to try and reduce the impact on collisions and pedestrian deaths and all the rest of it. So one of the greatest threats, which remains today, or constraints, not threats, to car design is legislation. Simon, what do you think?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it would seem to me that today, we're not talking about styling, we're talking about everything else, I mean, particularly pollution, obviously. I would wonder whether, and again, Richard would be able to speak with authority on this, the legislation that came in the United States, seatbelts, obviously, maybe some of the more extreme pedestrian dangerous styling. But I would have thought, and let's hear what Richard thinks, that styling changed, developed, not because of legislation so much, but because of the market. I mean, the Americans have always been brilliant at giving the market what it really wants. And not only did they do this through the 50s, but they also did it on and continue to do so. Obviously, they did take cues from Europe, whether it was the MGTC or certainly the Beetle, and the attraction of those funny little cars from Europe obviously was noted in Detroit, and that affected the design as well. I wonder whether it was, certainly in terms of styling, I wonder, apart from removing some of the worst successes on the front bumper, I wonder how much of it was due to legislation and how much was driven by the market.
Well, it's an interesting one, but I think certainly, as you say, America led the way in terms of legislation on environmental issues and passenger and pedestrian safety. So I don't know, it's arguable. So maybe the two coincided. Maybe it was a change in taste, a change in demand at the same time as legislation came in requiring that, you know, the pointy bits on the front weren't good and everything had to be so far apart, interior and exterior. But Richard, are we ready to have a look at a quick screen share with some of the cars we've got in this class? Just, we've got about 5 more minutes, but it'd be fun to look at
Sure.
some of the cars we have, just to give an example of the difficulty the judges are going to have when it comes to trying to decide a winner and a runner-up of this class.
The 49 Cadillac Series 62 Club Coupe, you know, what a statement car. 48, 49, first tail fins, the aviation principles. You know, just the V for victory and in the emblems and the adornment. People just, I mean, the masses just ate this stuff up, and you know, the chrome and personally, I would love to see chrome bumpers come back on cars today, of course, with safety constraints, but it's a particular element of style that just went away, and they kind of cladded the car and made it all, you know, American style or design kind of went away later on. You know, this certainly went away, what you're seeing here. And I just think people love good looking everything. So
yeah,
the thing that always made my heart skip a beat with that Cadillac, that particular model, was the fastback. You know, that wonderful sweep of roof, which, although, I mean, we had seen that in some cars in Europe, obviously, but that really was the signature of that particular model. There was a real glamour about the back end of that car.
Yeah, quite agree.
And then we like the 49 Packard, they're doing everything they can at this time, but they're having a tough time, and you could see that from the ornament that's on the hood of the car, just not, people were figuring this out. Something just wasn't right, and they would of course compare it to something else. And I'm not the person to really critique the Packard, but I think this is a good looking car, and the element of style was lifted off onto all of these cars, but they were all embracing automobile design as the critical technology of the day. And GM, of course, and I didn't get into this because it's kind of a mouthful, but you know, GM invented car design, being the #1 reason for car sales, and of course, they used it as a powerful edge or a first mover business advantage, first against Henry Ford, later on against Packard and all their competitors in the 50s. But you had all these great designs coming out of all the car companies throughout the world, and really Japan was just getting started, and they had to. The nice thing about this car is they had to build this car out of a full-size clay model, and they still do that today, of course. But getting back to the other cars on the list, let's see here. Oh, here I got to do this. I mean, come on, the Nash, the Pininfarina, Statesman. I mean, this is a really cool looking car, and it's very unique. And Battista Pininfarina's got his fingertips. I mean, it's his fingerprints all over this beauty.
I agree.
And it's just an elegant car, and it's highly collectible. And you know, I don't know what the numbers are, how many are around today, but what do you think, Simon?
Well, Richard, I was going to ask, what did the loyal Americans feel about an Italian being brought in to style an American car? Did that have a cachet, or did they actually think that it was a kind of irrelevance? I mean, Nash, after all,
No, Harley
difficulties competing with the top three, the big three.
That's what it's all about. You know, what did the consumer want? And Harley had, you know, made it a point to go to the Paris Auto Show almost every year, except of course during the war. And he found out that people liked it, and Americans liked it, and wanted a contemporary of Harley's, let's say Europeans, Harley Earl of design, which was Pininfarina. And Harley hired Pininfarina to design custom cars for all of the brands, and there are those cars out there today. And so I believe that because, you know, Harley used Battista, and he was also a friend, as a consultant to General Motors styling at the time, that was the future. And of course, that relationship between General Motors and Pininfarina lasted until into the 80s.
Richard, we're going to have to call it a day. So do you want to just come back to take the screen share off so we can just see each other again? But it's been a fascinating conversation around these different cars.
I'm sorry we didn't get to the 1960 Cadillac, which everybody traditionally thinks, because the 59 was the most extreme with the tallest fins, they forget how elegant. There's a wonderful picture here in the dossier of an absolutely straight side view of the 1960 Cadillac convertible. And it's a very beautiful car, not just in the Detroit concept, context, but in any context, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, I think I appreciate the time. We could talk about it all day. I'm sorry we lost Ken. He said that, you know, his technical issues were getting worse, not better, so he had to drop out. But thanks us all for nearly including him. But to Richard and to Simon, thank you very much for taking part in this Concours virtual roundtable talk about the golden age of Detroit. It's a fascinating class as we've just dipped into it with our toe. I'm sure the judges are going to have a tough time, and we look forward to seeing what the public vote says about it as well.